My name is John Passfield, and the title of this reading will be John and Mother Goose Video 20, The Reflective Journal. So here is my novella, John and Mother Goose, The Carnival of Tales. However, I'm not going to read from the novella in this reading. I'm going to read from the journal. Instead, I will read from the journal, which I wrote while I was polishing the complete rough draft of the novella. So I'll hold it up. Here it is. It's put together with elastics. It is a manuscript, but it's on my website. And if you click on the cover icon, you can have the whole book on your screen to read, okay? The Making of John and Mother Goose, The Carnival of Tales. The colors are different. It isn't yet the novella. This is part of the planning, or at least thinking about the novella. So, let me get back to my note reading here. The journal is 46,000 words and covers all the topics that a writer thinks of while spending a month or 6 weeks polishing a work of fiction. The journal is available for free, as I said, on my website at johnpassfield.ca. I'll read 5 passages from that journal. Now, to make things easier, so I'm not holding up books as I'm reading, I will hold up 5 books that I'm going to refer to in these notes. 5 of my other books. Now, this was already published, or has already been published, John and Dickens, A Christmas Mystery. Some were already published when I wrote these notes, and some were in manuscript. But okay, that one is published now. This one is published now. This is a novel in which I'm the main character. There's my wife and I with our little Austin Healey sprite. John Passfield, Saturday Morning. These are all books I'll refer to. This is not yet published, as I'm reading this in March of 2024, but it's completed, and I drew on it as I was writing about John and Mother Goose. So John and Lewis Carroll, Wonderfall, in which I fall down into Wonderland and meet the Alice characters and Lewis Carroll. This is about to be published in March 2024, but isn't yet. John and Cassandra, that's the Trojan War. I find myself meeting Cassandra and talking to Apollo during the Trojan War. And then another one, the last one that I'll hold up here, Chatterton, A Self My Own. This is complete as of March 2024 as I'm speaking, and will be published. Chatterton, the 17-year-old from Bristol, who was a young poet and writer. Chatterton, A Self of My Own, but not yet published, but a book I refer to. So the idea is that you draw on concepts, ideas, forms from earlier books as you work on future books, and you explore those concepts. So that's why I'm holding them up and why I will refer to them in these notes. Now, as I said, these are 5 passages from my journal. So here's the first one. My first note on the possibility of a Mother Goose novella is dated Saturday, November 13th, 2022. The note and was recorded while I was still working on John and Lewis Carroll, Wonderfall, Falling into Wonderland. The note is almost nothing about Mother Goose. In fact, it doesn't mention Mother Goose or nursery rhymes at all, but it's interesting that it does contain some of the elements that I realized were central to the earlier novellas that I've written, John and Dickens and John and Lewis Carroll. The idea grew out of a wish to write more of the image scenes which I had written in those novellas. I enjoyed the scenario that the inner chapters 2 to 9, in those novellas are a dream nightmare, which John is having as he goes about his daily tasks, primarily as a writer of imaginative literature. So the note, even though it has nothing to do with Mother Goose and the nursery rhymes, contains a reference to 2 basic elements of the series of novellas. One element is that I would write stories for characters, which I would draw from the world heritage of mythical figures, right? I wanted to write stories based on mythical figures. Characters have already been created by earlier writers. The second element is that what is missing from the first note and should be included in a future novella to give it some dynamic tension is someone like the Gnat, G-N-A-T, from John and Lewis Carroll, who wishes to undermine the optimism of the human race. That seems to be a little unfair to the net as he's portrayed in that novella. But what I was thinking of there obviously was a negative force that would go against whatever would be positive in the potential novella. So you could say very little there. One is I'd like to write a book in which there's mythical characters from the world heritage who've already been created by other writers. The other is some character in there should be negative, should want to kind of undermine, destroy whatever's going on in there. Okay, here's the second note. My second note on the possibility of a Mother Goose novella is dated a week later than my first note. I was still working on polishing John and Lewis Carroll, Wonderfall. It occurred to me that the title and the premise would be John and Mother Goose. I also had the idea that John would be a detective, but that he would also be judge, jury, and executioner should his services be needed. It's interesting, too, that his first task would be to find out whether there'd been a crime. The name Kafka, K-A-F-K-A, the writer, is mentioned at the end of that note, and my little joke there is that my book would be less logical than a Kafka novel in terms of John finding himself in a world that he doesn't understand and being cast in a role that he's not suited for. So Kafka novels are famous for the main character not knowing what's going on in the world he's living in. Mine would be even more mysterious. The note also includes the idea that John would interview Mother Goose's characters, that each one would have a story that he or she would prefer to the story in which he or she is living. Well, Jack and Jill, they're living inside the story of Jack and Jill Went Up the Hill. So I would say that by the second note I had almost everything in terms of the premise for a John and Mother Goose novella. There's a concern on my part in the note with the absence of a plan for a negative force that I seem to see as necessary for a potential novella. This is interesting to me in that I would have to ponder for a while if I were to ask myself whether I saw the need for a negative force when I was planning in writing each of my novels. So I don't know. Number 3. By the third note on the possibility of a John and Mother Goose novella, I had a fairly full premise for the shape and content of the novella. My wife and I visited Sarasota, Florida, shortly after I retired, so my imagination seized on that as the winter home for Mother Goose and her troupe of nursery rhyme characters. That gave me the idea that they would perform in small tents throughout North America, as circuses and small carnivals used to do when I was a boy. In fact, that process was still going on when my wife and I visited Circus World, which I believe was in 1999-2000, the first winter of my retirement. And it's probably still going on now, though I believe that there are no performing animals in circuses in North America now, and perhaps in Europe too. So, the ambience of going to a field on the edge of town, there were no malls with large parking lots in those days, and strolling along the midway with the barkers out in front of the tents on the small stages, inviting you to come in and see something exotic, is a concept that came to me in my sleep as I was thinking about a potential novella with mythical creatures. So I had all that. Okay, here's the fourth of the 5 notes I'm going to read. I realized, too, at the time of my third planning note of Monday, December 26, 2022, that the premise of John visiting Mother Goose and her touring nursery rhyme troupe would give me a chance to work with mythical characters, which I suppose I could say is a serious topic in my thoughts. I'm interested in myth, M-Y-T-H, because I feel that myth not only captures the bare bones, the framework, the patterns of the lives that we humans lead here on the earth, but I also feel it's the framework upon which all the most lasting literature is built. I think that this is what T.S. Eliot was thinking of when he said that James Joyce had discovered a way to structure what Eliot thought of as the chaos of what was then contemporary living, circa 1922. It's what the writers of serious literature have always known. Homer knew it, and Shakespeare knew it, and so did Chaucer. Their works are all mythical simply because their works all have a framework which can be boiled down almost to the fairy tale, folk tale level. Commentators say that Shakespeare's works have echoes of fairy tales. Many have said that the first scene of King Lear is more fairy tale-like than realistic. Well, I think the best of serious literature is both fairy tale-like and realistic. I would even say that it's realistic because it's fairy tale-like, given the fact that fairy tales capture the patterns of human life at their most basic levels. Jack and Jill went up the hill. Jack and Jill fell down the hill. Like, what's more basic than success and failure alternating? 5, the last one I'm going to read. By early January 2023, 2 months after my first idea for a potential novella concerning mythical creatures, I had most of the elements of the Mother Goose novella in place. I had the novella form of 2 outer chapters as a frame and 8 inner chapters as the dream nightmare. I had John meeting Mother Goose and the setting up of that concern that there might have been a crime. I had the concept of strolling around the grounds of the carnival and meeting Mother Goose's characters. I had the idea of some characters telling John of their hopes for a replacement story for themselves without letting Mother Goose know that they were doing so. I borrowed the form that I'd followed, I believe since John and Cassandra, of 4 image units of the main character speaks to John, 1 image unit of John speaks to the main character, and 1 image unit of John thinks to himself. So that's micro-planning. I was very close to getting the ideal novel title, and I drew the diagram, which now appears on the cover of the novella. That's of John and Mother Goose surrounded by your characters. So I drew myself a cover. By January 14th, 2023, the missing element, the Mother Goose character who would provide an opposition to Mother Goose, began to speak in his own voice. I didn't know who would say, "There never was a list, John." I didn't know who would say that line. But I was on the trail like a good detective of Jack and Jill fame, as the character who would provide the dynamic tension that the Nat provides in John and Lewis Carroll. As an aside, I'm not sure who provides it in John and Dickens. Perhaps Dickens himself is the negative character who wants to undermine things. I don't know. I'm not really sure. Along with that opposition speech, Jill's story of sculpting and visiting Mount Rushmore came to me in full form. I remember that after writing the Jill monologue of her becoming a sculptor in the drama on Mount Rushmore, I decided I simply had to write the novella, as it would be a shame to have written that inner story and then not have written the outer story, which would give it a frame, which would justify its life. When I was able to clear my desk, I began to work on the novella full time. So those are 5 notes from the journal, the reflective journal that I wrote while polishing John and Mother Goose. Now here's a note that I've written for this video presentation. It's interesting for me to go back and look at these notes about the planning and the writing of my Mother Goose novella. A fellow writer once expressed surprise that my novels draw on such a variety of settings, characters, and concerns. My answer at the time was that each writing project is a response to my reading and understanding of a topic that interests me. And since I'm interested in many topics, I've written a series of novels and novellas on a variety of topics. I would add to that now that I have a better understanding of the 2 basic elements of serious literature than I had when I first started to write. I would say now that the 2 basic elements of serious literature are, number 1, the surface story of character, situation, and event, and number 2, the underlying layer of interpretive imagery, which gives the item of serious literature its potential meaning. I would also add that the surface story of situation, character, and event has many variations in my novels and novellas, which now number 37 fictional works, while the interpretive imagery is actually drawn from 2 sources. 1 and 2 again. Number 1. One source from the surface story of situation, character, and event, in that the information acts as imagery, calls for interpretation, which means there's quite a variety in my works of fiction. And number 2, the other source of imagery is from that universal repository of information which is based on the similarity of the lives of all human beings. This imagery is drawn from the elements that are common to all human lives. All humans are individuals. Almost all humans live in some form of society. or I would say within many overlapping circles of society, and all humans by virtue of living on this earth are living in the same cosmos. So we're individuals, we're members of society, we live on the earth. It is from these three sources, the common human situation, that the second layer of interpretive imagery is drawn. Ernest Hemingway once wrote that he didn't want to write more than one novel with the same setting. So I suppose if one broke his life down into eras, one would say that he was born in Michigan, served in the First World War, served his writing apprenticeship in Paris, visited Spain in the 1920s for bullfights, and in the 1930s during the Spanish Civil War, was a war correspondent during the Second World War. He lived many years in Cuba and enjoyed fishing in the Caribbean Sea. Now, I suppose if one looked at the list of the Hemingway novels, it would be possible to conclude that Hemingway's desire to not repeat himself was carried out to his satisfaction. Not repeat his settings was carried out to his satisfaction. Thomas Wolfe wrote novels that were very close to his own surface life experience as well. He changed the names of the main characters, but many readers feel that there is much of a sameness to the lives of Eugene Gant and George Weber, who are fictional characters in the novel of Thomas Wolfe. So if you don't write about people other than yourself, your novels can all seem very similar. This is my point. In a discussion of the narrowness of the two writers, the sameness of the surfaces of the Hemingway and Wolfe novels does not concern me except to wonder whether the authors were able to include the widest range of subsurface imagery in order to explore the depths and breadth of the life experience, the individual social and cosmic life experience with which the human being is concerned and with which all serious literature deals. What I find is that the lives of the people whom I find in the biographies and the history books widens the scope of my own contemplation of the nature of what it is to be human in the world, far beyond what my personal life experience has been able to provide. So I write about all of these characters to just get a wider range of thought about what it's like to be human. What's interesting to me is that in my first 29 novels, all except one have characters other than myself as the main character. The exception to that practice is in my 26th novel, John Passfield's Saturday Morning, in which I am the main character. Of the 8 works of fiction that I wrote after my 29th novel, only one does not have me as the main character, and that's in my novella, Chatterton Life of My Own. So I switched from never being in my novels, except for one, to always being in my novellas, except for one. However, in the books that I've written since my 29th novel, I've combined 2 basic elements. I, John, am the main character in each of these works of fiction, but so too is either an historical character or a literary character present as a major character. So I now seem to have 2 main characters at least. What I'm striving for, what every writer of serious literature strives for, is to make all of his or her characters, whether based on the self, on other actual people, on literary characters or mythical characters, by the situations in which they find themselves and the ways in which they respond to these situations, illuminate the human experience of living in this world. So no matter what the surface of the novel, is it about all of us and how we are all living our lives as humans on this earth. This is my novella, John and Mother Goose, The Carnival of Tales. It's found on Amazon. You'll find more information there. It's found on my publisher's website, roxmillspress.com. On my website, johnpassfield.ca, you'll find the planning notebook and you'll find the reflective journal. Both free. Just by clicking on the covers, you can get to read them. So if you're interested in these topics, all about literature and how literature interacts with life, connects with life, reflects life, have a look. Lastly, I'll just say thank you for watching this video.